See how it goes. Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome. We are live now. Welcome to Coffee and the Crusades. This is the Real Crusades History live stream. I'm Jay Stephen, and guys, I'm really happy to have Joe Morrel with me today. Joe is somebody who is an expert on medieval Sicily. This is his area he works in academically, and we've gotten a chance to talk a little bit and go back and forth on that subject. But I'm just really, obviously it's a fascinating topic, so it's great to have Joe on. Joe, thanks for being here. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Kind of roasting down here in Texas.
Yes. Oh yeah. It's that time of year for sure. So quick question for you. How did you get interested in medieval Sicily, and what's kind of your area that you're working on for the most part at this point?
So I got started on a bit of a whim. I read David Matthews' Kingdom of Medieval Sicily because my family is Norman by heritage, and so it was a Norman history, picked it up, fascinated I became with it. There are just so many facets to it, and it's such an unusual area from your usual medieval historical study that when I started looking for a dissertation topic and I was throwing out ideas with a good professor of mine, that one ended up sticking because anyone who studies the Islamic world finds things in Norman Sicily. Anybody that studies the Byzantine world, plenty of things in Norman Sicily. And then, of course, big Normans connected to the wider Western European world as well. So you have this nucleus of all of the Mediterranean societies in this little island, comparatively little. It's about 2/3 the size of Britain.
All right. Well, that's yeah, I definitely agree with you that's getting some interesting feedback there. I don't know if only I heard that, but well, anyway, I really agree with you about Sicily. I mean, that's been an area of interest for me. It figures, to some extent in, Crusades history. It's kind of a precursor to the First Crusade. Obviously, a lot of the Normans from that area got involved in the Crusades. And yeah, I'll be honest, I kind of want to launch things off with a question about that. This might be too big a question for just this kind of stream, but what do you think about the idea of Sicily as kind of a precursor to the Crusades? Like, I mean, specifically, Roger the First, his biographer, Geoffrey Malaterra, it's kind of that famous chronicle. Do you feel that are we losing Joe there? It's funny because Joe is like just a state over from me, and we're having technical issues, but Helena and Sam on the other side of the world.
Question cut out there.
Yeah, I was just actually saying it's kind of funny. Like, you're just a state over from me, and we're having technical issues. And then when I have Sam or Helen on, and they're on the other side of the planet, it's we don't usually have that. But anyway, I think are you getting delays on your end, Joe, with my questions?
Yeah, your whole question you started asking just totally froze up.
Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of. All right, let's try one more time and see if we can get it to work, and otherwise we may have to try to figure something else out for next time. But apologize about the technical issues, guys. But so yeah, what? Let's actually drop my question there, because we do have a question from Genu. He actually did a super chat. Let's see here. You kind of have it spread out here, Genu. So I think we might. I'll tell you what. Let's try this. Joe, what area are you currently working on, like in terms of your current studies academically with medieval Sicily?
You cut out about half the question there.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to probably have to figure this out again some other time, Joe. Which I really hate that because I would just love to get to talk to you with everybody on this, but I guess for now the tech thing is just not working for us. So let's. I guess we'll have to call it off for today. I'll go ahead and finish the stream solo, guys, and then Joe and I will get together off camera later and see if we can figure out what the tech issues are, and hopefully we can have Joe on again sometime. But sorry about that, guys. Sorry, Joe. Thanks for making time for us anyway, though.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, so here we go. And I hate that because God, Joe is he's got a lot of interesting stuff to contribute, but it seems like we're just not getting through on the tech thing. Oh well. God, that's disappointing to me. I really wanted to get to talk to him because you guys know I'm a fanatic for medieval Sicily. So, but it's really funny because we have Sam and Helena on all the time, and Sam is in Turkey, and Helena is in Greece on the freaking other side of the world, and it's just everything runs smooth as silk. But then I have somebody on in the state over next to me. He's in Texas, and it's we like can't get the connection to work. So, oh well. I do hate that, but I guess that's just how it is. But we will carry on, guys. I'll try to survive my disappointment in not being able to have Joe on today, but I will message Joe back and let him know that we want to figure out what was going on and try to get him back. Now we have exchanged a bit previously on email, just kind of back and forth talking about some stuff, and he knows his stuff, and he's done some really interesting work. So that's too bad that we can't talk right now. But okay, but we do have I will tell you guys this. I just jumped into Power Chat, and Power Chat has been acting weird lately. They went from Joe wants to try his camera phone. I'll tell you what. Yeah, let's just reschedule. I'm talking out loud as I'm looking at my email. But since we're kind of already into it, I'll see if he can just come back. Well, I don't know what the heck. Let's try it. Let's give it a shot. Everything's already kind of crazy today. You guys are the regular crew around here. You're not gonna be too upset if things are a little bit amateurish today. That's okay. This is a relaxed live stream where we just kind of chill and hang out. Let me send Joe the link one more time, and let's see if his phone does any better for us. But anyway, while we're waiting for Joe to get back on, let me look at. There are a couple of power chats here that I missed the last couple of episodes, and I apologize for that. One is from Bear Cave 7. I hope that he's here today. He says, in 1107, Sigurd led the Norwegian Crusade. When he arrived, how different would his men have looked compared to those of the First Crusade? I know the Viking Age had passed, but would they have stood out among the Franks? I think that's kind of a difficult question to answer, Bear Cave. And thank you for the power chat. But my assumption would be that they would not have looked that different. I don't think at this point, the armor and the type of weapons used were pretty standard across Christendom. They would have looked basically like what we would expect from from like the Bayeux Tapestry is kind of always my reference point for that point. It was the mail hauberk, it was the iron cap with the nasal guard often, which, it was not standard. There was some variation to how that could look. But I will say that I can't really answer that with total confidence. My impression, though, is that Sigurd and his men would have looked roughly like Latin Christian warriors looked at that point. And but yeah, that's a really good question. I appreciate that. And then let's jump over to Ginu's question, which I think when I was getting a little bit, turned around a bit when we were looking through, when we were trying to get Joe's thing to work. Okay, there's Joe again. Let's see if this works.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Hey, Joe. How's it going?
Doing well.
Okay, that seems to be working. Well, let's. That would be awesome if we could kind of salvage this topic today. So I guess you can hear me. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, you now seem to be coming in loud and clear, and I'm not getting any roboting or anything. So maybe we are where we need to be then. So awesome. Okay, so Joe, let's kind of keep testing the waters here. So medieval Sicily is your thing, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And what are you currently working on in terms of, your current academic studies?
So I actually got a copy of several articles that I wrote 2-3 years ago now. COVID delayed printing on everything. So I have several articles published on the Islamic conquests, the early Islamic conquests, and their effect on the Mediterranean, Byzantine responses to them, and so on. I have another article in the works on the Almoravids and their strategies and conquests of Morocco and Spain, and I'm also weaving that into my dissertation because they had such a wide-ranging effect, and Sicily is so central that anything that happens on either end of the Mediterranean finds its way to Sicily.
So what is your time period that you most focus on? Are we talking kind of like 9th century, 10th century?
Most of my work's between the 7th and probably 11th centuries. Time-wise, I'm not so tied down, but I do tend to focus on the Mediterranean, specifically the Syria, Sicily, and Morocco.
Okay, and so it sounds like, an area that you are looking at quite a bit is this period from the Muslim conquest in the 9th century, around that period, into the Norman conquest. What is your impression generally of the changes that took place in Sicily in that time frame? I mean, not to get too broad of a question, but so it's kind of basically a Byzantine stronghold to start off with, and then the Muslims take it over, and then the Normans take it over. I mean, how do you think Sicily's character changed in that time?
So Sicily was, if anything in Magna Graecia was a hardcore Roman province, that was it. You have records of the Roman conquest in the 3rd century BC, and it remains a part of Rome, a central part of Rome, all the way through the trials of the 3rd century crisis, the 5th century, even in the 7th century with everything Byzantium lost. Sicily is still Rome, or it's still part of Rome, still a breadbasket. I mean, even Belisarius had his campaigns in Italy fueled by grain from Sicily. And that doesn't change until the Islamic conquest, really in the latter part of the 9th century. They begin in the 860s, but that conquest is very slow, which interestingly mirrors the Norman conquest. It's also very slow. We don't see any decisive battles like you see with the Battle of Hastings, and now all of a sudden England is a part of the Norman Duchy. So for the conquest of Sicily by the Arabs, they start to take over from the south end of the island, south and east, or sorry, south and west, because they're coming from Tunisia, and they're moving their way northeast. And as they're moving, they're pushing these, what we might call Byzantines, I suppose. They thoroughly see themselves as Roman. They are Greek in language and culture, but still see themselves as part of the Roman Empire. And they're slowly being pushed throughout this roughly 100 years of conquest. But they're also pretty thoroughly pushed out. By the time the Arabs actually control the island, the only real Grecophone regions are in the northeast around Messenia and in the south around Syracuse. And even Syracuse is pretty heavily Arabicized. And when the Normans come in the 1060s and thereafter, they see a lot of people who look like Muslims, but are actually Greeks who have taken on Arab culture, Arab dress, even Arabic as a language. So the cultural changes in Sicily are fairly drastic, or I guess comparatively drastic, compared to the Roman continuity in the latter 9th throughout the 10th century. But by the time the Islamic conquest has solidified on Sicily, the Normans come in about 20 years later. So Sicily is in a demographic flux for a very long time.
All right. So what do you think about the idea that the Norman conquest was kind of a proto crusade? Like, do you think that the Normans themselves, like people like Robert Guiscard and Roger the First of Sicily, viewed what they were doing from any kind of religious perspective?
Whether Guiscard did or not, it's kind of hard to tell. I think he probably did have a genuine piety, even if it's one that in the modern world we wouldn't recognize. He does found a lot of religious establishments and a lot of, and this actually caused problems at the time, but a lot of the war booty he took from his conquests, he used to fund monasteries, churches, the bringing of St. Nicholas to Bari. All of that is funded by the wars that he waged pretty much ceaselessly for his adulthood. But the Crusade indulgence is clearly recorded in about 1060 or 1061 in the record of the Norman conquest written by Geoffrey of
Malaterra. Okay.
Yeah. So Malaterra is the one that records that. If there are papal documents to that effect, I haven't found them yet. I can't say that I'm digging hard for those either. I tend to focus on economic issues. But at least with Malaterra, it's very clearly recorded that the Pope offered indulgences to anyone who would go to Sicily and conquer it from the infidel. So, I mean, perhaps it's a proto crusade insofar as they're not taking the cross. I mean, that was a very literal thing for the initial crusades. The red or the cloth crosses they would stitch under their shoulders. As far as we can tell, they didn't do that with the Sicilian conquest. But you see both in Spain and in Sicily during the 11th century, before the general crusade movement, you see the popes and other bishops offering spiritual indulgence for those who would go and fight for Christendom in those areas.
Yeah, the impression that I get from Malaterra is that definitely Roger, I mean, obviously we don't know what was in his heart, if you will, but the impression he was trying to convey was that what he was doing was kind of a type of holy war, or whatever it would have been understood to have been at that time. he
Yeah.
wanted to give that impression that he was doing something for Christendom, which I think that probably makes sense, especially in the time when obviously that is at the heart of this Latin culture. You know, the church, religion is such an important thing. So it's like, this is for him to kind of portray in this chronicle that that's part of what he was doing. That, you know, that would be a winning message, you know, to a broader audience across the Latin world. So that's always kind of intrigued me, just because of how close it really is to what you find with like the preaching of Pope Urban II during the First Crusade. I mean, it's almost like, I mean, I had a professor once say that there's really no break where the pre-Crusades end and the First Crusade begins. It's all kind of the same thinking all through that period, which, you know, I think probably makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There are, when we go about defining what we call a crusade, as far as scholars are concerned, the whole reason we call it a crusade is that taking of the cross, which that's how it's worded in all the Latin documents and all the histories written about that period. The only real difference between what you see earlier in Spain and Sicily is the simple fact that they're not sewing crosses under their clothes. That's about it.
Yeah.
Everything else is there. So yeah, go ahead.
Sam actually has a question. I think it's pretty good. Sam's a Ottoman history expert, and he's studying in Turkey right now. But he says, did Sicilian Arabs write any chronicles? If they did, what did they think of the Normans? That's a great question, Sam. Thank you for that.
So there are no Islamic chronicles from Sicily proper, but you have a couple of histories that are written much, much later. Ibn al-Athir writes in Mosul in the 13th century, I believe. Double check me on that.
Yeah, I think it's mid 13th century.
So he's considerably later. Supposedly, he's using the information on the Norman rule over Sicily from a Tunisian. Ibn al-Athir was himself Tunisian, but moved to Mosul. But he was supposedly using a chronicle from a Sicilian Arab who actually wrote about this history. The only problem is that document was lost centuries ago, and we have no access to it. We only have references to what it may have been from Ibn al-Athir. And he's the earliest to write on it. There's also some by the famous Ibn Khaldun, but his is also building off of Ibn al-Athir and a couple other local historians. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot from their view, as it were. It's kind of the same on the Greek end. We don't have Greeks talking about the Norman conquest. It's a couple of Italians and one Frenchman, Geoffrey of Malaterra, maybe from north of the Alps, that write on this at all. Now, part of that is not just the simple loss of historical documents over time. Of course, things degrade, things get lost, things get set on fire. But Professor Graham Loud has also, he wrote a wonderful article on all the things we've lost about Norman Sicily. The likelihood that we've lost tens of thousands of documents is very high. There are over 1,000 charters from, I think, Frederick II, or not Frederick II, Frederick Barbarossa. There are over 1,000 charters remaining from his chancery during his time in power. And reportedly, even contemporarily, the Normans were even more officious. They kept more documents, wrote more things down. And yet we have maybe 100 charters in total, written Greek, Arabic, and Latin. All of that together, we might have 100. And that's indicative of a great amount of document loss. Now, we do have one very clear instance of where we've lost a ton of stuff. The Kingdom of Naples was trying to protect things during World War II. And so they were moving these medieval documents from further south in Italy, where, of course, the Wehrmacht was, and the Americans and English were pushing northward. They tried to move it, and in transport, they move it to this new building to keep it safe from the war, and a German bombing raid bombs that building. And not because they wanted to, but because they were trying to hit the old building and missed. So unfortunately, out of sheer misfortune, we've lost centuries of documentation on the Norman kingdom.
So is there a good, there's a really good English translation of Ibn al-Athir from the Crusade period on through this series called Crusade Text in Translation. I've never been able to find a good English portion of Ibn al-Athir from before that. Is there an available English translation of Ibn al-Athir's accounts of Sicily from like the 9th through 11th centuries that you know of?
Not that I know of. There's a French one by Annalise Neff. If I'm not getting that mixed up with another document, I can always I can dig back through my computer later and email you things as I find them.
Yeah, I've always wanted to get to read Ibn al-Athir. That earlier stuff. It's just not widely available. When you're just looking for English translations. But yeah, that's kind of the thing with medieval Sicily. There is a lot that's obscure to the English speaking market, I guess.
A lot of the secondary research is done in Italian, French, and German.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's a lot available, but it's mostly trying to think. Numerically, you have a lot of Italians looking at it. There are a few French, and there are a couple of Germans. But yeah, the English are just just comparatively getting involved in Sicilian studies.
Okay, and Taco Cruiser has a good question. Was the Pope bullied into supporting the Normans after the Battle of Civitate? What do you think, Joe?
Bullied, I mean, bullied's probably not the right word for that. I think a realization of to use a German phrase, the Realpolitik. Popes weren't necessarily bullied by the Normans. More often, popes were bullied by wealthy Roman families. And just for the simple fact that the Pope is in Rome, these families are in Rome, they're highly political, and they're more than willing, for whatever reason, they're more than willing to stab a Pope. They didn't have a whole lot of qualms about that. Yeah. The Normans, on the other hand, wanted land. They wanted land. They wanted to stay. As my dissertation focuses on the Norman Sicilian economy, they were fabulously wealthy. These lands south of modern Naples were incredibly productive, very well connected to all the rich trade routes of the Mediterranean. So anyone that controls those islands and the south end of that peninsula are going to roll bank. So the Normans were clearly interested in that, but they also recognized that as Christians, they had to have the backing of the Pope. When you come into the Pope's lands and you're on his back door taking over his towns, he has a problem with that. But the Pope at the time had to judge whether it was better to let the Normans stay and take over these lands, but potentially be an ally over against these people he's living right next door with, who are more than willing to stab him in the night. Ultimately, I think the popes settled on allowing the Normans to stay and worked fairly closely with them. You see that several times during papal disputes. They don't go north to the Germans. They hate the Germans. They go south to ally with the Normans. So I think they sort of gave up on some of their southern land claims in the hopes of gaining an ally against these more nearby enemies, if you will.
Yeah, I do think that whole transformation is kind of interesting. The Normans show up, and at first the popes really are just talking about them like these bandits, these just murdering, pillaging highwaymen, and at some point they become pretty important papal allies. And I guess it does kind of tell us something about just the cutthroat world of 11th century politics. But then what's even more interesting is how that evolves pretty quickly into this very um, organized and powerful and wealthy and fairly centralized kingdom, that in these areas that the Normans conquer. So yeah, that is all pretty intriguing. But I remember reading a really interesting biography about Gregory the Seventh. It was a really old one, but the author, I'm sure it's kind of out of date now, but the author talked about how uh, that the popes initially didn't really get that much out of the Normans. Like Robert Guiscard, he was supposedly the Pope's ally, but for a long time, the Pope was kind of not really getting that much benefit from him. Like he was still being sort of, beaten up by the Holy Roman Emperor, and Guiscard never really did that much to help him. I mean, I guess finally there's the famous sacking of Rome, by Robert Guiscard's army, which is kind of this infamous episode. But I don't know. The whole thing is it's an intriguing part of history, and in some ways, it seems like Guiscard's the Normans who came after Guiscard were kind of more helpful to the papacy. I mean, like somebody like Bohemond, and who became this kind of central leader of the First Crusade, and but yeah, the way that all happens is kind of, especially like the involvement of religion in it. I mean, and that's something that is kind of intriguing. Like, how do you think? The Normans, it's kind of interesting, like the Battle of Civitate, they're fighting the Pope, and then when they beat the Pope, they like kneel down in front of him and ask for his forgiveness, but they hold him hostage. So just from your perspective, how does that work? Like this supposed piety, but at the same time, you can kind of treat the Pope like he's a political bargaining chip. I mean, do you think that points to any level of insincerity, or is it just a different type way of viewing religion than we're used to today?
Well, I think one thing that we have developed in our modern developments of the papacy, especially after the First and Second Vatican Councils, we almost hold the Pope in a special religious light that I'm not sure is really there in the Middle Ages. Okay. Walter Ullmann has a really good, probably dated now, but a really good thick book on the development of papal authority from the 10th through, I want to say 13th centuries. So that real development of what we would consider the classical medieval idea of papal power. The Pope in the Middle Ages is he is the viceroy of Christ on earth. He is the stopgap, something that more recently Benedict XVI has, how would you say, like more defined his office as. He's the last barrier against dissension and heresy, if you will. So the Pope in the Middle Ages is religiously an authority, and he does bear special reverence because of how high up he is in that clerical hierarchy and the very unique place he has as a sort of, I mean, for lack of a better term, the king of the church. Obviously, Christ is the king, but that earthly authority that is similar to a king. Your king, you can rise in rebellion against for good reason, for whatever that might mean. I mean, certainly the issue in England with John and Magna Carta is sort of the point that everyone goes to, but you can see certain instances where other vassals rise against their king, and the king is still their lord. He still deserves their loyalty and respect, but he may need correction. And that's something I think you see with the Norman relationship with the Pope is the Normans really latch onto that. They latch onto it more than most other monarchs do until the latter part of the Middle Ages. Someone like Frederick Barbarossa or any of the Byzantine emperors, they're trying to control the Pope. They're trying to make the Pope their plaything or their the stamp on their authority, the religious stamp on their authority. Where the Normans recognize that the Pope is the religious authority for the church. But that doesn't mean he gets to tell them what to do with their land. And certainly if the Pope is going to existentially threaten their kingdom, they're going to fight back. But that fighting against the Pope doesn't make him any less the head of the church. It just doesn't make him the governor of Civitate, if that makes sense. So they divide the secular and religious roles of the Pope a lot more sharply than we tend to today. Though if you look at modern church legislation and such, technically that is the case. But I think the Normans lived it out in a way that we don't see in other societies. And so it comes as a bit of a shock to us.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, I heard this story once about some town in Italy where every year they would lock the patron saint's statue in prison until it rained or something, like kind of a, like hold that saint hostage until, their prayers are answered or something like that. So yeah, it's kind of, there are these different ways that religion was, dealt with and the way it was understood. That that's one of the intriguing things about, this history to me, is kind of understanding that. So, all right, let's jump over to a few more questions. Okay, so Genu has this massive question that I'm going to read. He sent it through Power Chat, so I want to get to it. So Genu, we are going to jump into your question here, and I'm going to go ahead and read it out. It's pretty big. Let's see. This is a question about the potential missed opportunities the Kingdom of Jerusalem suffered from during its existence. In its infancy, Baldwin I, who Barber Tyreman suspect was bent, whereas he could have been rendered infertile, proposed marriage to Adelaide Queen Adelaide of Sicily as one of the prerequisites to accepting the marriage. Baldwin I agreed to make the matronly Adelaide's son, Roger II of Sicily, heir to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Along with immense wealth and soldiers, Adelaide brought actual triumphant ruling experience that very few women in the Kingdom of Jerusalem's history had. Considering how vital Sicily could have been to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, along with the Hauteville dynasty's record, how costly a mistake would you say Baldwin I made in 1117 when he succumbed to papal pressure from Pascal II and repudiated Adelaide and their marriage, earning the ire of Roger II and delineating Sicily from the Kingdom of Jerusalem in perpetuity? In other words, do you think that a strong bond with Sicily in the nascent stages of the Kingdom of Jerusalem would have made a marked difference in the destiny of the kingdom?
I mean, for as long as that question is, the frank answer is yes. Just because there's papal pressure doesn't mean that it's good to say yes. In this case, the vast wealth that Sicily had was something that Baldwin could easily have used. And especially the tight ties that he had through Adelaide to those purse strings of Sicily, just on an economic level, he absolutely could have used that. Politically, too, there were massive numbers of troops that were available. Sicily was fairly populous, though there were demographic issues, but we can answer that in a different question. The armies of Sicily were fairly powerful, and even more so, and more to the point of the Crusades at the time, Sicily had one of the only professional navies outside of Byzantium. So they had a massive fleet, a powerful fleet, and could easily have bolstered the Crusade movement with those fleets through that political connection between Adelaide and Baldwin. So earning the ire of Roger as every rebellious baron in southern Italy found to their chagrin, was just never a good thing in the first place. But for someone like Baldwin, who is in such a precarious position, being surrounded by enemies like that, he absolutely needed that more powerful kingdom to back him up. And it would have been much easier for him to have that political relationship because of that marriage. So for him to repudiate Adelaide was probably a misstep. I understand, being the Kingdom of Jerusalem, there's a lot of political tension where you do kind of have to do what the Pope requests of you, because there's such a tight connection between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Christendom as an idea at the time. But as we see later, when Roger solidifies his hold on the kingdom in the 1130s and early 1140s, he's so secure in his power and his fleets are so powerful, he actually makes a raid all the way around the Greek coastline, from Dyrrhachium all the way down through the Peloponnese and up just about to Constantinople, sacks Thessalonica twice, and goes home. And the only reason he did that was to show his might against the Byzantine emperor. But interestingly, there are a lot of cartularies and documentation that shows a close relationship between Sicily and the Holy Land, despite Adelaide's repudiation. So really what you get there is a political issue and not something that's seen on the ground. There are lots of crusaders that make their way through Messina. That was a major point for crusade travels to the Holy Land. Then there were a lot of holy orders. The Knights of St. John, for example, had extensive lands granted to them by Roger in Sicily that they largely funded their efforts in the Holy Land off of. So connection with Sicily is not sundered by that choice, but I think Baldwin at that point lost a very powerful card in bowing to the whims of the Pope, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, those are some good comments there. And I've always kind of thought that was a pretty big missed opportunity for the Crusader states, because Sicily is the obvious best connection when you think about it. I mean, the naval aspect of it, the incredible wealth of the kingdom. If early on, Jerusalem had almost become just a part of the Kingdom of Sicily, that probably would have been a good thing strategically. I guess the issue is, Baldwin was a great king, but he also, he had his faults, like any ruler, and he could be kind of rash at times. And I think, especially when he was in a precarious situation, he had been married previously. I think that was one of the issues. He'd been married to an Armenian woman, and he had put her aside to marry Adelaide, I guess was the thing. And then I also would it'd be interesting to look at why the Pope was making such a big deal out of that. Like, I wonder if it had something to do with he was concerned about the power of the Kingdom of Sicily at the time. Like, I mean, not to say that the Pope didn't have a genuine religious reason for requesting that separation, but one wonders if there was more of a political motivation behind that. I suspect that probably had something to do with it. I'd have to look back at that to refresh myself on what was motivating the Pope to make an issue of that. Because obviously the popes didn't always, you could just about find a reason to call into question just about anybody's marriage among the nobility. So, but yeah, that is intriguing. I think also too, that was right before Baldwin died. I think he was struggling with illness at the time, and maybe he was worried about actually burning in hell if he didn't do what the Pope wanted. I mean, that does come up with kings in this period, is suddenly doing what the Pope wants becomes more important when you're sick or when you have a festering war wound or something like that. So yeah, really an interesting topic though.
Yeah, well, and it would be again, I'd have to go back and look. There may have been some tensions between Pascal and Adelaide through whoever it was that Roger had supported, because there are a couple instances where Norman kings support they later become anti-popes. We don't know if it was a real papal election or not, but the Normans have on occasion supported the opponent of the reigning pope. So they kind of find themselves on the I don't know a nice way to say that, the list, if you will,
Right.
the black list of the Pope, on more than one occasion. That may have something to do with it.
Yeah, Ginu's pointing out that it was related to this dispute about who the Patriarch of Jerusalem was going to be, and I remember that was always a big deal for the kings of Jerusalem. They wanted a patriarch who was aligned with them. And early on, Baldwin I had this issue of the popes were kind of almost trying to make the patriarch superior to the king. And Baldwin really resisted that because he wanted full access to the wealth of the church to fund his armies, which he needed to be able to fund to, fight the Saracen enemies. So this was a big deal. I guess this would be a whole rabbit hole we could go down. But yeah, I do remember what you were talking about there, Ginu. Not the details, but Ginu's got this big icon of the Punisher as his handle there. But so okay, but yeah, let's do like a couple more questions here. Sam had a good one. Joe, are there some good books about medieval Sicily, like general books that you think would be good for somebody to pick up?
Yeah, I will warn you ahead of time. Nobody's written one that's short. They're all quite voluminous. A good starter is Donald Matthews' The Kingdom of Medieval Sicily, or Norman Sicily. You can look up either one. But Donald Matthew, University written. I think he's emeritus now, but he wrote that book in '95, and it's a wonderful survey of demographics, economics, geography, and socio-political situations from the Norman conquest through the Hohenstaufen period. And I want to say he ends on Tancred and the Angevin. No, Tancred's before Frederick II. So he ends right on the Angevins. So you get a good survey from the 11th through the 13th century.
Okay, yeah, that is a good book. I do remember reading some of that a long time ago. Now that you pointed that out, but yeah, that is a really good one. There's also there are a couple of really good translations out there of Geoffrey of Malaterra and the other one, the guy who wrote about Robert Guiscard. I don't remember.
Amatus of Montesino.
Well, not that one. That's a good one too. I don't think there's a good English translation of it out there that's just widely available. But there's a let's see. I will recommend Richard Brown. If you look him up, he did a translation of Geoffrey of Malaterra. You can get it for like under $20 on Amazon, which is great. And he also did one of let's see. Well, we'll just say, A Portrait of a Warlord, The Life of Robert Guiscard, which is a translation of William of Apulia. So that's worth picking up too.
Anything by Graham Loud is really good. It tends to be really long. He's very, very detailed. His History of the Latin Church in Sicily is very good. It's a little more niche. It's not exactly an introduction to the subject, but it's like 800 pages, so it's quite thorough. But he does have one of his earlier publications, The Age of Robert Guiscard. That's essentially a history of the Norman conquest, but he also goes into the potential imperial pretensions of Robert Guiscard and his invasion of Byzantium. So it's another good one to start with. So I'd say Laud's Age of Robert Guiscard and Matthew's Norman Kingdom of Sicily.
Yeah, that one's been on my list for a while. The Age of Robert Guiscard, and yeah, Graham Loud is an awesome scholar. He did a really good survey of Frederick Barbarossa's source material for the Third Crusade, which is also worth checking out. So, okay, let's do one more question. We kind of went longer than usual just because we had the tech stuff at first, but I'm really glad we were able to make this work. This is kind of an interesting one. This is from Patrick. This is sort of later than our topic, but would the Ottomans have been pushed out of Europe before 1600 had the French not allied with them against the Habsburgs? What do you think about that, Joe? Just to kind of throw an odd one at you. We appreciate the question, Patrick.
Yeah, I actually teach this era at UD.
Okay,
so,
great.
That's a good question, actually. The French in the early modern period do whatever they want to make sure the Habsburgs don't get whatever they want.
Right.
And I mean, it almost becomes laughable after a point. Possibly, part of the Ottoman strength in that period is that you have an Ottoman Empire. You have this massive body with a unified political vision, or more or less. I'm sure experts could dice that up a bit, but you have more or less a single political vision with a general political aim, as opposed to Europe, where you walk into the Balkans and you've got Southern Greeks, Northern Greeks, Thessalonians, Serbians, Yugoslavians. You go north and you find Bulgars and Transylvanians and Hungarians, and they all hate each other. But generally speaking, they work together when the Ottomans invade. The closest you see the Ottomans getting pushed out is really after that second siege of Vienna and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth coming into play. I'm not sure that the French did much more than draw away some Habsburg attention, because the Habsburgs are also a massive entity, even if they are having hell in Germany at the time. But they can use their Spanish holdings to deal with the French. Or they can use their Spanish holdings to deal with the Ottomans in Africa, while they use German holdings on the Rhineland to deal with the French. They're able to kind of turn their cameras in different places, if you will. I think the Ottomans were just able to hold on because they had the kind of unity that empires like that bring, where the disparate kingdoms of Europe, they all had to try and work together and often didn't.
All right. Well, I think that's a good end to our stream today. Well, Joe, I'm really glad you joined us. It's always fun to do these, and I was looking forward to getting to talk to you. So I'm glad that you made some time for us. We appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Okay, guys, we will see you next time, and we will certainly get Joe on with us again as his schedule allows. So we will call it a day for now. Thank you guys for being with us.